So now I would like to bring to the microphone our second speaker, Dr. Ben Smith. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you all today, and thanks everyone for joining online at what can be a tricky time, particularly for those with kids. Hopefully you don't hear my two running around in the background too much. But today I'm going to be talking to you about how we can use online programs like one that we're currently working with OCA to evaluate, called iConquerFear, to increase the accessibility of treatment for fear of cancer recurrence or progression, which, as Lisa highlighted, is such a common problem. As Lisa's done a great job of outlining, we know that fear of recurrence is incredibly prevalent, particularly in populations such as women affected by ovarian cancer. We've got about 60% of cancer survivors generally who are experiencing either moderate or severe fear of recurrence, which is causing significant distress and impact on day-to-day functioning. But I'm not going to be talking too much, about describing fear of recurrence or progression, which I think Lisa's done an excellent job of. I'm really talking about how do we manage this issue, and giving you some examples from the iConquerFear intervention that might be beneficial for you in terms of managing any concerns that you might have. The one thing I would like to note, just moving on from that last slide, is that we know this is really common in caregivers as well. So I don't know if there's any caregivers on the call, but this is, we know that it could, in some instances, it's even more prevalent in that group. And I guess the one thing that researchers showed is that actually, even though you might worry about burdening your caregiver with your own concerns and vice versa, it does actually help to air those concerns. And that idea of a burden shared is a burden halved certainly rings true in this case. So don't feel alone if you're experiencing these worries, and don't be afraid to share them, would be two key messages to take away from that. So as Lisa alluded to, the good news is that there are actually some effective treatments for fear of recurrence or progression. One of them is ConquerFear, which was developed in Australia by the Psycho-Oncology Cooperative Research Group. It's a 5-session individual therapy delivered face-to-face by a psychologist or psychiatrist. And as Lisa alluded to, the goal of this therapy is really not to eliminate these thoughts or concerns, because we know that to a degree they are highly rational fears. But the goal of this treatment is to really, give people, help them to develop or figure out what's important to them after cancer, and develop goals to give their life purpose, meaning, and direction, and then to equip people with strategies that help them to assign less importance or attention to their concerns about recurrence. So to live well with those concerns kind of more in the background. But in a big trial where ConquerFear was compared to relaxation training that was matched in terms of the number of sessions and the time with the therapist, what was shown was that ConquerFear, even though both groups, fear of cancer recurrence, improved over time, the gains were particularly large in the ConquerFear group, and were maintained and even increased out to six months post-treatment. The problem is, unless you're lucky enough to have access to one of the fantastic therapists like Lisa, who is a specialist and is highly trained in delivering these kind of therapies, there's just not enough of those specialists to meet the huge demand that Lisa mentioned. So OCA has recognised this issue and has tried to, use the online medium to make getting help for fear of recurrence or progression more accessible. And so the first thing that they did was to develop this fear of cancer recurrence booklet. And then subsequent to that, as I mentioned, we're currently working together to evaluate the iConquerFear program, which is more of a, which I'll explain more about in a second. But just to give you a bit of an overview of the Fear of Cancer Recurrence booklet or fact sheet, which is available to everybody here via the OCA website, you can see from the contents page what kind of things are included in this. It covers, what makes people worry, the kind of worries that people have. It touches on the impact on caregivers as well, and then aims to equip people with some kind of practical strategies that they can use. And in a study conducted by some colleagues at the University of Sydney, 50 women in collaboration with OCA evaluated the booklet, and 3/4 felt it was relevant to women with ovarian cancer. 2/3 felt it was moderately helpful for managing worries, and more than 90% would recommend it to other women in that situation. However, we didn't actually see any significant changes in fear of recurrence after a relatively short period of a week accessing the booklet. So the conclusion after this study was that this may be helpful for, women with less severe fear of recurrence, but that more intensive solutions might be required for women with ovarian cancer, in particular, who might tend to have more severe concerns. So, as I said, that's where this partnership has developed to refine and evaluate an online self-guided program that Lisa and I and other colleagues have been working on for several years, called iConquerFear, and you can see the homepage here. And I really just want to give you a brief, overview of what this intervention entails and some of the strategies that it contains. So this is what the dashboard looks like. The intervention contains 5 modules, which roughly map onto each of the 5 sessions in the face-to-face intervention. So there's a close match between what we know works from the face-to-face intervention and what's delivered in this online self-guided program. And it contains a lot of videos from both clinical experts and people with lived experience. This is Professor Jane Turner and Jill Stannard, who's one of the consumers who worked with us on the program. And the first, that I've tried to highlight here why this program may be more beneficial than a more static resource like a booklet. The first module is really focused on helping people, establish what their values are in life, what they find important after cancer, and develop goals and actions to live a life that's consistent with those values. So there's a values clarification task where people sort through these values that you can see listed here into their most important and least important values. And then we step people through the process of, reflecting on those values, giving them feedback on whether the goals and actions that they're presenting. So if people, depending on what kind of responses people give in this program, you get tailored feedback specific for you that helps you decide whether those values and goals are particularly important to you and realistic for you to achieve. The second thing that, as Lisa mentioned, with more severe fear of recurrence or progression, it's typified by a really these intrusive and persistent worries, but also a real focus on physical sensations that people interpret as potential indicators that the cancer could be coming back. And to combat this, we deliver an exercise called attention training, which is a slightly bizarre exercise, to be honest. At first glance, it involves listening to an array of sounds and focusing in on particular sounds and then switching between sounds. And that may seem, you might be wondering, what's that got to do with recurrence or thoughts about recurrence or progression? But I guess, as Lisa alluded to, what this program is trying to do is to help people if you think of your thoughts as just different types of noise, we want people to be able to tune in to the important thoughts and give less attention to that background or annoying noise. A bit like if you might be at a concert and you want to listen more to the guitar versus the vocals or something like that. And the goal here is to stop people from being so self-focused on these inner thoughts and sensations and more externally focused on interacting with the environment and people around them. So, and we provide graphs that each time people do this exercise, they rate how they're doing, and we can help people track their progress over time. Another strategy, which, you can all do at home, is, if you want, there are plenty of examples of this on the internet if you want to look them up. But of course, I'd encourage you to join iConquerFear if it's of interest, is detached mindfulness. This is a bit different to some forms of mindfulness you might be familiar with, in that it doesn't involve meditation or focus on the breath, and you don't need to practice it every day necessarily. But the idea behind this is to help people realize that their thoughts are just that, thoughts. That don't have to be engaged with. They can be treated like clouds passing by in the sky, or perhaps like trains passing you by at a station, which are going to destinations you don't want to go. You don't have to hop on. And it's really to give people this appreciation that they don't have to get caught up in these thoughts, and help to train them to stop them from doing that. Another real pragmatic strategy that's included in iConquerFear is something called worry postponement, that some of you may be familiar with. And again, this is something that I guess can often be really revealing for people, because it shows that you can put aside your worries, and it doesn't, because one of the things that are thought to, I guess, play a key role in the development and maintenance of fear of recurrence or progression is these beliefs that worry can either be quite negative, in that if you worry too much, you might even cause your cancer to come back, or you might have positive beliefs around, if I worry a lot, I'll be really prepared. And exercises like worry postponement make people realize that, I guess, that there is really that the consequences of worry are not inevitable. So you can, it encourages people to, if they start having thoughts about the recurrence coming back, to just recognize that, say, I can see I'm getting worried about this, putting it aside and saying, I'll deal with it later. And then literally putting aside, 10-minute, you can write them down if you want, but then trying to focus again on whatever activity thing you are engaged with, and then putting aside 10 minutes at the end of the day, preferably not too close to bed, where you can worry about or focus on those worries if you really want. But what happens in a lot of cases is that people come to that time and they're like, I'm kind of, that's not so much of a concern for me right now, and they realize they don't have to worry, and that they have been able to keep going all day without that worry being a big issue for them. The iConquerFear also contains, I guess, some tips or strategies to help people find that balance that Lisa alluded to, between finding that not being constantly focusing on physical symptoms. Obviously, that's a real concern for women affected by ovarian cancer, but I guess there are some strategies like just thinking about whether this is a symptom you've had before, whether there's some other explanation for it, and just deciding on a period of time, which might just be 24 hours to sit with that, and then perhaps calling the OCA helpline if it's still an issue, for instance. And there's also, I guess, some, women living with ovarian cancer are dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So there's some tips on things like healthy eating and physical activity, which are not only beneficial in terms of, I guess, your well-being when you're living with cancer or beyond cancer, but also can help you regain some sense of control after cancer. And ultimately, what the intervention hopes to deliver is a kind of new way of addressing these concerns when they do come up. So what do we know whether this actually helps? So we've done a previous study in breast cancer survivors, and we know what we saw. It's a bit hard to see here, but was that there was relatively high levels of usage of iConquerFear, and you can see here some of the feedback that we received from women, which was generally really positive. And what we did see is that there was only one group in this study, but there was just what we saw is in the women who used iConquerFear, there was a reduction in fear of cancer recurrence, both immediately after they'd finished using it, 10 weeks, and then further 3 months later at 22 weeks. And what we perhaps unsurprisingly saw was a suggestion that those who used the intervention more derived more benefit. And perhaps more surprisingly, it tended to be older women who used the intervention most, which was really pleasing because it made me feel that we'd, I guess, delivered it in a way that made it quite accessible to everybody. And it was also shown that people with more moderate levels of fear of recurrence were perhaps those that used it most. Those with more, like the highest levels of fear of recurrence or progression, and may not be best suited to that. Might be, perhaps that face-to-face therapy is more useful in that context. So is it useful for women affected by ovarian cancer? Well, that's the question we're aiming to address in the study that's ongoing. Is this both a safe and acceptable and potentially effective tool for women with ovarian cancer to manage their fears of recurrence or progression? So if you're interested in taking part, we're looking for women who are diagnosed with stage 1 to 3 ovarian cancer and who have completed their hospital-based treatment, but if you're on maintenance therapy, you're still eligible. The website's only available in English presently, so you need to be able to be proficient in English, and obviously be an online intervention, you need internet and email access. Just to give you an outline of how the study works, this is what's called a randomized study. So there's a short screening measure or questionnaire you complete at the start, just to make sure it's suitable for you. It's not really designed for people who have really serious other mental health concerns like depression. So if you report that in the initial screening, you'll just be offered crisis information and further support from the OCA team. But then if you're not in that category, then basically we flip a coin, or like a computer flips a coin, to be honest, and you're then based on the outcome of that coin toss, you're allocated to either get immediate access to iConquerFear plus that Ovarian Cancer Australia FCR fact sheet that I mentioned before, or if you're in this what's called a waitlist group, you just get immediate access to the fact sheet. And then after 8 weeks, that group gets access. Both groups complete an assessment, and the waitlist group gets access to iConquerFear. So all participants ultimately get access to iConquerFear, but randomly allocating people to groups is the best way for us to be sure that any effects that we see at the end of the study are due to iConquerFear and not just to other random variation among the participants in the study. So if you are interested in taking part, what's involved? Well, there's no kind of set time that you have to spend using iConquerFear. We encourage people to spend about an hour a week for about 8 weeks. There's a few questionnaires to complete, which take about 10 to 15 minutes immediately or before, immediately after, and 3 months after using iConquerFear. And then there's some very short surveys at the end of each module just to get your impressions of the content in that module. And then there's also the option to participate in an interview to gain a more in-depth summary of your experience. Who's behind it? So there's a lot of researchers, clinicians, and consumers from University of New South Wales, Sydney Uni, Flinders Medical Centre, or Flinders Uni, as well as Ovarian Cancer Australia. So it's a really multidisciplinary and strong team. And if you want to take part, I'd encourage you can either go directly to the website. If you've got a phone, you can just use it to scan that QR code there. And I'll just stop there in case anyone does want to scan that code, but happy to take questions if anybody has them.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that valuable presentation, and what a valuable program it is. So thanks for providing that overview. I do have one question. If my partner is worried too, is there anything like iConquerFear that might be able to help them?
Yeah, so as I said, fear of recurrence or progression is really common in caregivers as well. And we haven't designed iConquerFear specifically for caregivers, but we do encourage people to work through it with a loved one if they so desire. And as I mentioned briefly, the OCA fact sheet does also have a specific section for caregivers. But I guess the key thing, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, is it's really, I know it's not an easy conversation to have necessarily, but to share your concerns with those closest to you certainly seems to alleviate the concerns for both parties.
Thank you. And just one more question. I know this is what someone has written. I know this is just feeding into my fear of recurrence, but how important is it to get second and third opinions when it comes to treatments such as chemo?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, as Lisa kind of alluded to, it's a bit of a fine line between seeking reassurance and the kind of feedback effect that can have on fear of recurrence or progression. But I certainly think there's no harm in getting a second opinion. But I guess I'm not a medical practitioner, so certainly something that you should discuss with your existing clinician, but I don't think many of them would discourage that necessarily.
Thank you, Ben.